They said Lee Sung-jin was untouchable. In boardrooms sealed with silence and rooms guarded by men who never blinked. His name carried authority without explanation. Deals closed because he nodded. Enemies disappeared because he paused. His empire moved the way he did. Precise, controlled, unquestioned. And beside him, always just slightly out of frame, was Imani Cole. She didn't announce herself when she entered a room. She didn't need to. Her presence was already understood by those who mattered. Impeccably composed. Observant in a way that made people careful with their words. She wore elegance the way others wore armor. Quietly, effectively. This was the life she had built into. Not inherited. Not borrowed. Built. Imani understood the machinery of power better than most men who claimed to own it. She knew which alliances needed tending, which egos needed space, which silences were dangerous. For years, she had moved beside Sung-jin not as an accessory, but as balance. But balance is invisible until it's gone. The first cracks didn't come with scandal. They never do. They arrived as omissions. Meetings she was no longer invited to. Conversations that ended just before she entered a room. Decisions already made, already executed. And then there was the shift in him. Lee Sung-jin had always been disciplined, focused, immune to distraction. But now his attention lingered elsewhere. On appearances, on circles that valued polish over substance. He wanted admiration without resistance. Validation without weight. That was when Madeline Cross appeared. She fit seamlessly into the image Sung-jin had begun to chase. Effortless smiles. The right laugh at the right moment. A presence that reflected him instead of challenging him. Where Imani brought clarity, Madeline brought applause. And Sung-jin mistook the difference for progress. Imani noticed everything. The restructured accounts. The subtle changes in security protocols. The way her name was quietly removed from places it had always belonged. This wasn't infidelity. This was preparation. Still she said nothing. Not because she didn't feel the shift, but because she finally understood it. For years, she had believed loyalty spoke louder than assertion. That endurance was proof of love. That silence was strength. But standing in a house filled with luxury and absence, Imani recognized the truth with startling clarity. Power doesn't announce when it's leaving. It simply stops supporting what no longer honors it. That night, as Lee Sung-jin prepared to present a new image to the world, Imani made a decision of her own. She would not fight for a place that required her to shrink. And without raising her voice, without demanding explanation, the woman beside the throne began to step away. Unaware to him, but unmistakable to the empire that had always responded to her steadiness. The crown had not been lost. It had only been waiting. Imani Cole learned early that real authority didn't announce itself. It settled into a room the way temperature did. Quietly, undeniably. Changing how people breathed, how they chose their words. When she walked beside Lee Sung-jin through private corridors and guarded entrances, eyes followed her not with curiosity, but calculation. Men adjusted their posture. Conversations softened. Not because she demanded it, but because they sensed what she carried. She never corrected them. Sung-jin ruled by precision. Everyone knew that. His reputation was sharp, deliberate, carefully cultivated. But what few understood was how often decisions reached him already refined, risks already weighed, outcomes already anticipated. Imani did not sit at the head of the table, yet her influence shaped where the table stood. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was measured, never wasted. A raised brow during a negotiation. A single question asked at the end of a meeting, calm and devastating. Men left those rooms convinced they had made the right choices, unaware they had been guided there. Home she was the same. The house was immaculate without feeling staged. Security moved according to patterns she had quietly redesigned. Staff came and went with loyalty earned, not enforced. Sung-jin rarely noticed how smoothly his world ran. He assumed it was simply how things were meant to be. That was the danger of balance. Once it became normal, it disappeared. Imani noticed the shifts long before they took shape. The pause before her name was included. The brief glance Song-jin gave his phone during conversations that once held his full attention. The way silence lingered where ease used to live. She catalogued each change without emotion, the way one notes weather patterns before a storm. She did not confront him. Not yet. Queens did not compete for attention. They observed. They waited. At gatherings, she remained poised at his side, dressed with understated elegance, her presence grounding the room even as conversations drifted toward him. When others spoke too freely, she caught it. When they tested boundaries, she noted it. Song-jin mistook her composure for compliance. He was wrong. Imani understood something he had begun to forget. Power was not loud. It was relational. It lived in trust, in memory, in the quiet understanding of who kept things from collapsing when pressure mounted. And pressure was mounting. She felt it in the way old allies hesitated before speaking, in the subtle uncertainty that crept into rooms once steady, in the faint imbalance that followed Song-jin like a shadow. He was reaching for something shinier now, something that reflected him instead of steadying him. Imani remained still, not frozen, not afraid, just aware. Because when the moment came, and it would, she would not need to raise her voice or make a scene. The throne did not belong to whoever sat closest to it. It belonged to whoever made it stand. And she had always known which one she was. Lee Song-jin had never questioned his authority. It followed him everywhere. Into glass-walled boardrooms, into dimly lit back rooms, into conversations that stopped the moment he entered. He was accustomed to the way people straightened when he spoke, the way laughter arrived a second too quickly at his jokes. Respect had become automatic, fear predictable. But respect, he was learning, was no longer enough. Somewhere along the rise of his empire, Song-jin began to crave something softer, warmer. He wanted to be admired without calculation, praised without hesitation. He wanted rooms that welcomed him instead of bracing for him. Applause, not obedience. He told himself this was evolution. In elite circles far removed from the shadows he commanded, image mattered more than dominance. These were spaces where power needed polish, where reputation had to be palatable. Song-jin watched how men like him were received there, how their edges were softened by the women at their sides, how approval came wrapped in smiles instead of silence. That was when Madeline Cross caught his attention. She was effortless in ways that felt intoxicating. She admired him openly, laughed easily, touched his arm as if his presence delighted her rather than weighed on her. With Madeline, Song-jin did not have to explain himself or defend his decisions. She asked no difficult questions, offered no quiet corrections. She applauded. He mistook the feeling for peace. Around her he felt lighter, less scrutinized, less exposed. Where Imani's gaze had always been steady, perceptive, Madeline's was affirming. She reflected him back to himself exactly as he wanted to be seen. Powerful, impressive, unquestioned. Song-jin told himself he deserved that feeling. What he didn't recognize was the cost. Imani had never applauded him. She had balanced him. Where his instincts leaned toward expansion, she had measured consequence. Where his ambition pressed forward, she had anchored him. Her silence had never been indifference. It had been discernment. But discernment does not flatter. As Song-jin leaned into spaces where his name was celebrated rather than weighed, he stopped noticing the absence of her counsel. He filled rooms with approval and ignored the subtle unease creeping into his empire. Long-standing allies hesitated. Old certainties wavered. The rhythm of things shifted just slightly. He blamed logistics, timing, external pressure, anything but himself. At home, the distance between him and Imani grew, though he barely registered it. She no longer challenged his assumptions, no longer offered quiet alternatives. To him this felt like ease. To her, it was resignation giving way to clarity. Song-jin believed power was something you displayed. He did not yet understand that the most dangerous moment for a man like him was not when others opposed him, but when the one who steadied him stopped trying. Applause echoed all around him now. And he mistook the noise for security, unaware that the foundation beneath him had already begun to withdraw. Madeline Cross had always known how to enter a room. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being noticed. Her smile practiced but convincing, her timing impeccable. She understood optics, where to stand, when to speak, how to laugh just enough to be remembered. In spaces where power wore tailored suits and careful manners, Madeline fit seamlessly. Being seen had never been her problem. Being underestimated, however, was something she had learned to exploit. Lee Sung-jin fascinated her from the beginning. Not just his wealth or reach, but the gravity that followed him. Men deferred. Rooms adjusted. His presence altered the atmosphere without effort. To Madeline, that kind of influence felt intoxicating, and attainable if she positioned herself correctly. She told herself she wasn't replacing anyone. She was evolving something stagnant. In her mind, Imani Cole existed only as an idea. Distant, quiet, outdated. A woman who had failed to keep pace with a man who had outgrown her. Madeline believed proximity was proof. The closer she stood to Sung-jin, the more confident she became. Invitations arrived addressed to both of them. Her opinions were solicited, then echoed. She began to speak with certainty in rooms she had once observed from the edges. People smiled politely, listened carefully, adjusted, but something in their eyes remained guarded. She mistook caution for respect. What Madeline didn't understand was the difference between access and authority. Doors opened for her because Sung-jin allowed it. Conversations paused because his name hovered nearby. The power she felt wasn't hers. It was borrowed, and borrowing always came with terms. Imani noticed her rise without reaction. From across rooms and through second-hand reports, she observed how Madeline filled space loudly, how she confused attention for influence. Madeline asked questions meant to impress, offered suggestions meant to signal relevance. She mistook silence for absence. It never occurred to her that silence could be judgment. As Madeline grew more comfortable, she began to overstep. She spoke on matters she didn't understand, made assumptions about loyalties she hadn't earned, mistook Sung-jin's indulgence for endorsement. The empire listened, but it did not realign around her. Instead, it recalibrated. Old allies grew distant. Conversations ended quickly. Decisions stalled. Madeline felt the subtle resistance but couldn't name it. She assumed it was jealousy, or caution, or simply the growing pains of stepping into importance. She never considered that the balance had already begun to shift. At home, Sung-jin praised her confidence, her ease, the way she made things feel uncomplicated. Madeline glowed under the approval, mistaking affirmation for permanence. She believed she was ascending, unaware she stood on ground that was quietly giving way. Power was not impressed by enthusiasm. It did not respond to charm alone. And as Madeline reached higher, certain the crown was within grasp, she failed to notice the woman who had already stepped back, taking with her everything that had made the throne stable. Access had brought Madeline close. But closeness was not ownership. And soon the difference would matter. Imani did not discover the truth in a moment of drama. There was no overheard conversation, no lipstick on a collar, no confession forced by tears. What she noticed instead were patterns. Quiet, deliberate shifts that did not belong to coincidence. Accounts were restructured without her knowledge. Security routes adjusted. Invitations redirected. Her name removed from documents where it had always appeared, replaced by phrasing that felt provisional, temporary. It was subtle enough that anyone less attentive would have missed it. Imani did not miss anything. She sat alone one evening in the stillness of the house, a tablet resting on her knee, scrolling through records that told a story no one intended her to read. Dates aligned too cleanly. Movements overlapped too precisely. This was not secrecy born of impulse. This was planning. What unsettled her was not the presence of another woman. Desire was ordinary. Ego was predictable. What chilled her was the intent beneath it all. The preparations were not those of a man sneaking away from his marriage. They were the preparations of a man rearranging his life. She was not being cheated on. She was being phased out. The realization arrived without panic, without tears. It settled into her chest with the weight of certainty, heavy but clarifying. For years, she had sensed herself receding from spaces she once anchored. She had told herself it was temporary, that power ebbed and flowed, that loyalty would eventually be rewarded. Now she understood the truth. Loyalty unacknowledged becomes invisible. Imani thought back to every silence she had accepted, every correction she had softened, every moment she had chosen restraint over assertion. She had believed endurance was strength, that holding the line quietly would preserve what mattered. But silence, she realized, was only strength when it was chosen, not when it was expected. She closed the tablet and leaned back, the room around her immaculate and unfamiliar. This house had been built to project stability, but stability was an illusion when its foundation had already been reassigned. Somewhere beyond these walls, Madeline was being positioned, introduced, prepared, elevated. Not as a secret, as a successor. The insult was not emotional. It was structural. Imani did not confront Songjin that night. She did not demand explanations or offer ultimatums. She understood now that confrontation would grant him something he no longer deserved, the chance to frame the narrative. Instead, she did what she had always done best. She assessed. The next days passed as usual on the surface. Meetings were attended, dinners hosted, smiles exchanged. But beneath it all, Imani began to withdraw, carefully, deliberately. She stopped smoothing conflicts before they reached Songjin. Stopped reinforcing alliances he took for granted. Stopped compensating for decisions driven by ego rather than foresight. The effect was immediate, though no one could yet name it. Things took longer. Conversations stalled. Confidence wavered. Imani watched it unfold with calm precision. Silence had finally spoken. And it had told her everything she needed to know. Imani's withdrawal was so subtle that at first, no one could name it. She still appeared where she was expected. Still dressed with the same quiet elegance. Still listened with the same attentive calm. But the invisible labor, the smoothing, the stabilizing, the anticipation of problems before they formed, had stopped. At meetings, she no longer leaned in to offer a final, clarifying observation. She no longer caught Songjin's eye with a single look that warned him when a deal carried hidden risk. When discussions drifted toward fragile ground, she remained silent, hands folded, expression neutral. Songjin noticed the ease. Without Imani's interjections, decisions felt faster, cleaner, unchallenged. He mistook this for progress. He didn't realize that speed without direction only shortened the distance to collapse. Outside the rooms he commanded, the empire began to lose its rhythm. Long-time allies hesitated before committing. Trusted intermediaries delayed responses. Information arrived incomplete or late. Small misunderstandings surfaced where clarity once lived. Nothing dramatic. Just enough friction to unsettle. Imani felt it too, the tremor beneath the surface. She had been the one absorbing those tensions, translating between egos, reinforcing bonds no one bothered to acknowledge. Now she let the strain exist. This was not punishment. It was honesty. Madeline sensed the shift before Songjin did. Invitations that once flowed freely began to thin. Conversations she entered confidently cooled by a degree. People listened, but their eyes slid past her, searching for someone else. Madeline compensated by speaking more, by asserting presence, by stepping further into spaces she believed were opening for her. Each step forward met invisible resistance. Access, she learned too late, did not come with loyalty. At home, Songjin felt the tremor as irritation before he recognized it as danger. Deals stalled. Old assurances no longer held. He blamed inefficiency, distraction, the growing complexity of his world. He did not yet connect the instability to the woman who now moved through his life like a distant constant. Imani remained composed. She watched as Song Jin filled the gaps with confidence and noise, mistaking activity for control. She watched Madeline mistake proximity for command. And she watched the empire respond the only way it ever had, to balance. Balance, once disrupted, seeks correction. When Song Jin finally turned to Imani one evening, frustration sharpening his voice, she met his gaze calmly. She offered no defense, no explanation. Only presence. The kind that forced him to feel the absence he hadn't yet named. The empire trembled because its anchor had loosened. Imani did not announce her withdrawal. She did not threaten or demand. She simply stepped back. And for the first time, everyone felt how much she had been holding together. The cracks did not announce themselves with noise. They appeared as hesitation. A meeting postponed without explanation. A partner who requested revisions where trust had once sufficed. Messages returned hours later than usual, careful in tone, vague in commitment. The empire still stood, but it no longer moved as one. Song Jin felt it as resistance before he understood it as loss. Where authority once flowed effortlessly, it now met questions. Not challenges. No one was foolish enough for that, but pauses. Conditional language. The subtle recalibration of people who sensed instability and adjusted accordingly. Loyalty, he was learning, was not fixed. It responded to gravity. And gravity was shifting. Old allies who had once deferred instinctively now asked to see projections, reassurances, guarantees. They listened, nodded, and left without the certainty Song Jin was accustomed to inspiring. Newer partners watched closely, calculating risk with eyes that missed nothing. Madeline tried to fill the void. She attended more meetings, spoke more confidently, offered opinions with an enthusiasm that bordered on urgency. She dressed the part flawlessly, smiled at the right moments, positioned herself as indispensable. But the empire did not respond. Men who had once overlooked her now evaluated her. They asked questions she couldn't answer. Looked past her when decisions were needed. She sensed the shift and mistook it for resistance she could overcome with charm. Charm did not stabilize systems. Imani observed the changes from a distance that felt both deliberate and final. She had not instructed anyone to pull away. She had not whispered warnings or orchestrated dissent. She simply allowed the structure to function without her constant reinforcement. The result was inevitable. Without her quiet calibrations, small fractures widened. Miscommunications multiplied. Confidence eroded. The empire's strength had always been its cohesion, the way disparate parts moved with shared understanding. Now understanding frayed. Song Jin began working longer hours, pushing harder, demanding results. Pressure replaced precision. He tightened his grip, believing force could restore what restraint had lost. But power applied without balance only exposed fault lines faster. At home, the silence between him and Imani grew heavier, charged with things neither spoke. He noticed her absence in places she still occupied. Her presence quieter, her influence withdrawn. It unsettled him in ways he could not yet articulate. He had mistaken her stillness for passivity. Now he felt the cost of that mistake everywhere. The empire did not collapse. Not yet. But it leaned. And those who had built their futures around its certainty began to step back, one measured move at a time, aligning themselves not with the man who demanded loyalty, but with the force that had always made loyalty feel safe. Imani remained where she was. Watching. Waiting. Knowing that once cracks appeared, no amount of applause could hold an empire together. Song Jin had always believed control was something you tightened. When pressure mounted, he applied more of it. More directives. More oversight. More presence. He filled rooms with certainty, spoke louder, stayed later. He expected the world to respond the way it always had, by bending. Instead, it resisted. The first public misstep was small, almost forgettable. Partnership delayed. A statement released without the usual alignment. Nothing catastrophic. But the whispers that followed were new. Curious. Careful. People who once defended his decisions now watched them unfold with neutral interest. Power he was learning did not like desperation. As tensions escalated, so did his certainty that betrayal surrounded him. He questioned everyone, tested loyalties, demanded assurances. Each demand peeled away another layer of confidence from those who had once stood steady beside him. Men who trusted their instincts began to trust distance instead. Madeline tried to steady him. She praised his resolve, admired his intensity, assured him that dominance only needed to be reasserted. She spoke with confidence born of proximity, not understanding. Her words soothed his ego but offered no solutions. And the empire continued to slide. Deals unraveled quietly. Information arrived incomplete. Decisions were second-guessed before they were executed. The seamless machinery that once defined his reach now moved unevenly, as if unsure which direction to follow. Songjin felt the shift acutely. The crown he wore had grown heavier, less responsive. He was still obeyed, but obedience without belief rang hollow. It did not sustain. In private moments, he began to sense what he had lost, though he could not yet name it. The rooms where Imani once sat felt colder. Conversations ended without clarity. He missed the subtle corrections, the calm recalibrations, the way outcomes once seemed inevitable rather than forced. He mistook absence for defiance. When he finally confronted Imani, frustration sharpening his voice, she met him with a calm that unsettled him more than anger ever could. She did not deny anything, did not defend herself. She listened, eyes steady, expression composed. "You wanted to lead alone," she said quietly. "So I stepped back." There was no accusation in her tone, no triumph, just truth. Songjin felt something fracture then, not in the empire but in himself. For the first time he understood that power was not a possession. It was a relationship, one he had neglected in favor of applause. Outside, the world continued its quiet recalibration. Allies aligned elsewhere. Confidence shifted. The structures he once commanded began responding to a different center of gravity. The crown had not been stolen. It had moved. And as Songjin stood amid the remnants of authority he no longer fully commanded, he realized the most devastating truth of all. The throne rejected kings who mistook noise for leadership. His fall did not come with spectacle. Came with clarity. Too late to change what had already chosen its owner. Songjin saw her clearly only after everything else had gone quiet. The rooms were the same. Polished surfaces, guarded entrances, familiar faces. But the energy had shifted. People no longer leaned toward him instinctively. They listened, nodded, and moved on. Authority remained, but reverence had drained away, leaving something brittle in its place. It was in that emptiness that he began to notice what had been missing all along. Imani moved through the world now without adjusting herself to his orbit. She attended fewer functions. When she did appear, she stood on her own terms, calm, self-possessed, untouched by the urgency that clung to him. People greeted her with a warmth he no longer inspired, sought her perspective with a trust that unsettled him. For the first time he watched instead of assuming. He noticed how conversations changed when she spoke. How tensions eased without effort. How certainty returned to rooms that had grown cautious. It was subtle but undeniable. This was what he had traded away. The realization landed slowly, painfully. Imani had never diminished him. She had steadied him. Where he had mistaken her restraint for complacency, she had been exercising judgment. Where he had wanted applause, she had preserved balance. Madeline's presence, once intoxicating, now felt hollow. Her assurances echoed without substance. She offered affirmation when he needed insight, encouragement when he needed correction. The difference was stark and irreversible. Songjin found himself replaying moments he had dismissed. Imani's quiet pauses, her measured questions, the way she saw around corners he never noticed. He understood now that her silence had been choice, not weakness. That her loyalty had been active, not passive. and that he had mistaken accessibility for power. When he finally spoke to her again, his voice lacked its usual certainty. There was no demand this time, no frustration disguised as authority, only acknowledgement arriving far too late. "I didn't see you," he said quietly. Imani regarded him with calm eyes. There was no satisfaction there, no vindication, only clarity. "You did," she replied. "You just didn't listen." The truth settled between them without drama. He saw then that her withdrawal had not been revenge. It had been self-preservation. She had stepped away not to punish him, but because she refused to be diminished further. Recognition did not restore what had been lost. The empire had already realigned. Trust had shifted. Influence had found its proper place. Songjin could see it now. The way people moved toward Imani without prompting, the way stability followed her presence. The crown had chosen. And standing before the woman he had underestimated, Songjin understood the finality of it all. Seeing her now did not grant him redemption. It only confirmed what he had lost. Imani did not take the crown the way others expected. There was no announcement, no public declaration, no symbolic gesture meant to signal victory. Power did not require ceremony when it had already been recognized. It gathered around her naturally, the way it always had, quietly, decisively, without asking permission. She chose distance first. From Songjin's world, from the endless calculations and compromises, from the spaces where her presence had once been assumed but never honored. She stepped into rooms where her voice was invited rather than tolerated, where her judgment carried weight without explanation. The difference was immediate. Allies who had once hesitated now approached her directly. Conversations that stalled under pressure found clarity again. Decisions settled into place with an ease that felt almost startling. It wasn't dominance that guided these moments. It was trust. Imani understood then what she had always known but never claimed aloud. Authority was not something bestowed. It was something recognized. She did not need Songjin's acknowledgement. His realization arrived too late to matter. What mattered was that the systems he once controlled responded to her steadiness, her restraint, her refusal to lead from ego. Madeline faded from view without drama. Access without foundation could not sustain itself. The empire adjusted, shedding what had never truly belonged. And Imani remained. Not beside a throne, not behind one, but apart from it entirely, sovereign in her own right. She built something quieter, stronger, shaped by intention rather than appetite. Influence flowed through her choices, not her proximity to power. For the first time, she moved without needing to compensate for anyone else's ambition. Songjin watched from a distance he could not cross. He saw how the world responded to her now, how stability followed her steps. He understood finally that what he had lost was not a wife, but the axis around which his empire had turned. Imani felt no triumph in this understanding, only peace. She stood one evening at a window overlooking the city, lights spreading out like constellations beneath her. The future felt expansive, unburdened by the need to prove or endure. She had chosen herself, not in defiance, not in anger, but in alignment with her own worth. That was the crown, not gold, not title. And as she turned away from the view, leaving behind the world that had underestimated her, it was clear to anyone who truly understood power where it now resided. The crown had not been claimed. It had found its owner.